Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Hudson Institute for a most interesting discussion on China and Latin America. Our distinguished speaker is Dr. Evan Ellis, a great teacher and a gentleman. Dr. Ellis has been a welcome speaker on Latin America since the beginning of our Center of Studies back in 2005. We have always shared a high esteem for the academic work of Dr. Ellis. Today, we'll be fortunate to listen and view one of the most interesting chapters of his latest book and innumerable academic articles. After he finishes his presentation, we'll open a period of questions and answers. Let me also mention our appreciation to Rachel Cox, our Director of Public Events, and my assistant, Laura Ruiz. And without any further ado, I turn the podium to Dr. Ellis.
Sure. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me say it is a real privilege and honor for me to be back here at the Hudson Institute and to be able to share my thoughts with you and to have really the privilege of continuing to interact with the distinguished Ambassador Daremblum, with whom, as he mentioned, I've had the real honor of being able to work these past, really more than 10 years. So what I'm going to talk about today is recent advances with Chinese engagement in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is a topic that I followed for some time. Let me just mention also that my current position is as the Latin America Research Professor at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So, as a employee of the government, I am obliged to mention that everything that I'm going to say today is my own personal opinion and in no way represents my institution or the position of the U.S. government. But having said that, I think you'll find that I'm more than happy to be very direct and very frank. And so, a warning in advance. You've probably seen any number of different media articles talking about Chinese advances in Latin America and in the Caribbean. In the number of years that I've done this, I like to divide China's progress in its relationship in the region into a number of different phases. Really, before 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, most of China's focus was on the struggle for diplomatic recognition of the region's different states between the PRC and the Republic of China, Taiwan. With 2001, when you really saw exponentially a trade by the PRC and its companies with Latin America taking off. The interesting thing about that initial period was that while there was a lot of news coverage and excitement, it really was a period with very little physical presence by Chinese companies in the region. Starting about 2008, 2009, and really helped along not only by the maturation of Chinese companies and the growth of Chinese needs, but also by the global financial crisis at the time, you saw a significant advance of Chinese companies into the region. And I argue that fundamentally changed the imperatives not only for the companies, but also for the Chinese government. Because for the first time, although the Chinese government has long been consistent about its policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of countries in Latin America and elsewhere, this caused Chinese companies and the government to begin to worry about, how do you help your companies win projects? How do you help to protect your employees and companies on the ground against the very real challenges, everything from crime and social protests, et cetera, that you find operating in a very challenging environment. So in many ways, it created imperatives that how do you really help your companies and people now that they are physically present in the region while remaining consistent with those policies that you proclaimed? I also argue that really in about the past 2.5 years, we've really entered a fundamentally different chapter of China's relationship. On the one hand, of course, as the Chinese economy itself has decelerated in its continuing growth, that has combined with other factors to cause a fall in commodity prices, which overall mean that the actual value of Chinese trade with Latin America has been falling for the past about 2.5 years. Now, it's important to recognize that actual physical sending of products and contracts and political advances are actually continuing to rise. But the dollar value of benefit, if you will, has actually fallen off a little bit. And also, frankly, one can argue that we are moving to a more mature phase of the relationships. From the early days in which, as one of my esteemed Chinese colleagues, Zhang Sushui, used to talk about, the lovable Chinese panda there to help the region to develop in win-win scenarios. Back then, you either saw China as the ferocious dragon that would eat the region and its companies, although actually for China, a dragon is actually a beautiful mystical creature and not something necessarily evil. Or you saw China as a bit of a savior. I would argue that today there is a maturation understanding that doing business with China is different than doing business with Western companies, with its own challenges and its advantages. But I think we're in a very different phase than we were just a few years ago. So the question almost always comes up, what is China attempting to achieve in Latin America? I would argue that China has been remarkably transparent at a certain level about what it is trying to do and its intention to have a broad engagement with the region. If you go back to China's first policy white paper with the region in November 2008, and take a look also at the more extensive white paper released in November 2016, and also if you look at, for example, President Xi's perhaps best broad policy statement, a framework that he calls 1+3+6, it's relatively consistent what China has said with what it has done. 1+3+6 means one plan. In other words, the idea that everything that China is trying to do in Latin America, politically, economically, militarily, and otherwise, is all going towards one unified effort. 3, which means that there are 3 vehicles. So the financial vehicle, the investment vehicle, and the loan vehicle. In other words, the 3 primary ways that China has sought to expand its influence. 6, in terms of the areas, and it's remarkable, the areas that China has mentioned, basically commodities, electricity, and I should say energy, foodstuffs, technology, etc. The areas that China has publicly prioritized have pretty much been the areas where they have most concentrated in terms of trade and in acquisition. Now, what we aren't always clear on is the details of some of those deals and some of the thinking behind that broad engagement. Having said that, though, I like to make the point that although China's objectives are fundamentally economic, that does not make them any the less strategic, and it does not make them any the less impactful for the United States. Because I always argue that the activities China is pursuing have a fundamental impact on the strategic position of the United States in the region and the ability of the U.S. government and U.S. companies to pursue their objectives, whether it's policy objectives or a certain agenda about trade and rule of law and democracy and other things. Having said that, it's also very important to recognize that China, having come into the current global order that was not of its own making, is doing certain things in Latin America and elsewhere to try to reshape, if you will, to make a world that is safe for the continued rise of China. So I like to call attention to a couple of very important things, which, while I don't necessarily say they're malevolent, they are very impactful for U.S. policymakers. One of those, of course, is the idea of multipolarity. In the 2006 white paper, China for the first time made a subtle but very important shift, recognizing that it not only recognizes the advance towards multipolarity and welcomes it, but actively seeks to promote that multipolar order. Now, in Latin America, we can consider Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia and Cuba as part of that multipolarity. In other words, without trying to associate itself with anti-imperialistic projects, at least not overtly, one can argue that China clearly benefits from the continued existence of those types of regimes that challenge the U.S. order. Not only does it benefit from continued access to the commodities and markets of those countries, such as Venezuela's 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, but it also benefits from the continuation of sources of challenge to the U.S. political, economic, and other project in the region, especially in places like Cuba and Venezuela, just across the Caribbean from some of the from the U.S. mainland. In addition to that, I like to call attention to what I call webs of friendship. China uses something called strategic partnerships. This is a term that its Ministry of Foreign Affairs uses. Sometimes we look at terms and say, well, that doesn't really mean anything. These are just words. I would argue that the Chinese take their terminology very seriously in this respect. And there are 7 what China calls strategic partnerships in the region. The first 4 were actually Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, then later Venezuela, and more recently Ecuador, Chile, and Uruguay, which actually received relatively little attention. The other interesting thing is that China uses those webs, which are accompanied by generally a ministerial level coordinating body, which meets at least once a year, in some cases sub-level working groups, whose goals are basically to try to coordinate and work out difficulties with the Chinese projects in the country, and sometimes also coordination on political and other affairs. Now, in not all of the 7 cases do those ministerial level committees work equally or meet often, but there are vehicles there, and these are the vehicles that China chooses to try to advance its coordination in the region. And beyond that, while we were maybe just a little bit distracted this past fall with the presidential election here in the United States, just about every single one of China's strategic partnerships, it actually silently upgraded to a new level that it had created, a comprehensive strategic partnership. China is actively working to try to increase that leverage and coordination in the region. Beyond that, it's also of note the type of multilateralism that China is pursuing in the region. So you have the fact that while China was and actually continues to be a very active participant in the Organization of American States as an observer, China actually chose the organization CELAC, an organization that was largely promoted by Venezuela and Cuba and others, as its primary vehicle for pursuing a relationship with Latin America. A relationship basically defining a table which explicitly excludes the United States and Canada as the 2 principal actors. You also see other areas where there is this strategic choice of multilateralism. So, for example, after the very unfortunate decision by the U.S. administration to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, President Xi showed up at the APEC summit in Lima last year, actively advancing the Chinese alternative, the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, based on a model called the RCEP. Now, the reason why this is of concern to me is that at the end of the day, the rules of the game in the very important Pacific from Latin America to Asia area matter very much. And if you compare the TPP to the proposed free trade area of the Asia Pacific, the new Chinese proposal is one that focuses almost entirely on trade, rather than giving attention to things like the protection of intellectual property or compensation for, or at least trying to get away from non-tariff barriers. Thus, states that have certain raw trade advantages, like China, who have the ability to use the coordination between state and companies to force open markets, while at the same time protecting their own markets with significant non-tariff barriers, et cetera, with an interest in gaining intellectual property. Basically, this is a rules of the game that strongly advantages China, one could argue to the detriment of a number of other countries in the region who have other positions, perhaps such as Japan and Korea. One can argue India as well, et cetera, as well as those countries in Latin America, from Mexico to Chile, et cetera, who have a stake in the protection of some of their markets and IP. Beyond that, also important to note that the international financial framework is a strategic objective of the Chinese. This is perfectly logical. China came into a world, the Bretton Woods financial system dominated by the U.S. dollar, in which we have the luxury of being able to run deficits and basically write checks to be paid later for any number of different things. The Chinese have tried to structure many of their deals, from agricultural deals to others, to banking swap relationships, to most recently in Chile a currency, an official currency transaction relationship, in order to get the RMB, their yuan, introduced into the international currency system. And indeed, you see this progress with the International Monetary Fund being able to, choosing to include the RMB in that currency basket. What I would argue is, finance is, for many of us, dry and boring, and that was a thing in school that you never wanted to go to. At the end of the day, changes in the international finance system have fundamental repercussions for the strategic position of the United States, and the advance of the RMB is something that we need to take very seriously, and the way in which China is using its transactions in banking relationships in Latin America and elsewhere in the world to do that. So beyond that, I wanted to, and I'm going to skip over some of these slides just a little bit because I want to leave time for questions and answers. But I did want to highlight that as Chinese companies have advanced in the region, they've advanced broadly across a number of different sectors. So we see that, for example, you have mergers and acquisitions, especially in the mining and petroleum sector. You have other activities in the agricultural sector. You have other activities in the construction sector, as China has moved away from what I would call gift-oriented construction to try to, building stadiums and roads, to, convince nations to switch diplomatic recognition, to a combination of initially construction in state-to-state deals in places like Venezuela in the Caribbean, like what they did in Africa, and more recently actually entering in a very competitive way in markets in which they previously were not competitive, including Colombia, including Chile, etc. And beyond that, manufacturing and retail, telecommunications, companies like Huawei and ZTE, and even now some of the big Chinese telecom giants, China Mobile actually looking to enter the Brazilian market, banking. And when I talk about banking, initially talking about loans, but moving beyond loans to actually branch banking relationships, especially in the Southern Cone, and most recently actually in Mexico as well. And other services, logistics we'll talk about. Again, in all of these cases, it's almost never Chinese companies parachuting into the region, but there's always a key role for local partners, local consultants, etc., who often hope to gain and leverage the many things, the access to credit, the access to certain solutions that the Chinese buy. And in each sector, it's a little bit different. And again, these are things that are becoming very, very significant. It used to be said that, well, Chinese just loan money. They don't actually invest money in Latin America. By some data, and there's actually a real paucity of good data, Chinese investments in Latin America is approaching $90 billion. And indeed, not even just in small countries, but for example, this year, for the first time ever, not only is China actually a larger trading partner with Brazil, Latin America's largest country, but for the first time this year, China actually replaced the United States as the major equity investor in Brazil. And that's huge if you think about it. In the past 2 years, almost $20 billion in investment, not just loans, but investment, equity capital from the Chinese have gone into Brazil. I want to talk about a few recent trends, and it's going to be a little bit on the commercial side, and if you'll bear with me, I think it's important to really look for a moment at some of these details to really have a feeling for how much is going on, because these are things that are not commonly talked about in detail in Washington. We oftentimes talk about just Venezuela or just something else, but for example, one of the recent trends that you see, and this is probably one of the biggest and least noticed trends in Washington, D.C., is the degree to which the PRC and its companies are capitalizing on significant economic weakness in Brazil, combined with the problems of the bribery scandal Lava Jato and the problems of Odebrecht, to actually enter the Brazilian market in major new ways and actually take over many projects that were previously run by Odebrecht and some of the other Brazilian major actors. You see this across sectors. Again, in the past couple of years alone, literally in about the past decade, 87 different verified projects, almost $50 billion in a total investment, $20 billion just in the past 2 years alone. In the electricity sector, for example, you see three of the largest companies in all of China. Mentioned the very, very largest, of course, State Grid, which does the majority of electricity production and transmission in all of China itself. They just completed a $10.8 billion acquisition of a company called CPFL with assets throughout Brazil. On top of that, at the BRICS summit, which just happened in Xiamen, they got approval of a $3.5 billion project to basically build a 2,200 kilometer transmission line from the Belo Monte Dam to the southeast of Brazil, a huge project that had been installed. On top of that, you have another Chinese giant, State Power Industrial Corporation, who has had a number of different acquisitions. They bought Pacific Hydro with major assets in both Brazil and Chile for $2.5 billion. They just took advantage of another sell-off to acquire the Sao Simão hydroelectric facility for $2.4 billion. They're, I understand, proposing right now to take over the assets of a important actor in Minas Gerais, of the San Antonio power. So even just in those projects right there, you're talking about $10 billion in new hydroelectric assets just for that one company. China Three Gorges acquisition of Duke Energy, $1 billion. In comparison, even that almost seems peanuts. China Nuclear Corporation has actually been in talks. It looks like they may very well complete Brazil's newest nuclear reactor, on top of work to complete the two nuclear reactors that are going forth in Argentina. In other words, the only three nuclear reactors right now going forward in the hemisphere, to the south of the United States, are all being done by basically Chinese companies. Logistics, although a lot of the attention given to Hudson Whampoa has kind of faded off, and really the six major facilities that Hudson has had around the region haven't really expanded much in recent years. Below the radar screen, you have a number of major new port projects. And so in the south of the country, in one of Brazil's most prosperous areas, in the port of São Francisco do Sul, you have a project to build out a major container terminal. A major bulk cargo terminal. You have another project in the north near Belém, which is going to the São Luís Maranhão terminal. You have another one where a terminal was just acquired in Paraguaná. And actually, up until the current moment, there was actually only one place where China actually operated airports in all of Latin America, and that was ironically in Colombia, the 6 airports around Medellin. However, for the first time, China has taken advantage. A company called HNA is going to be operating, or I believe actually is now the operator of the airport in Rio de Janeiro. So you see significant advances in logistics. You see significant advances in agriculture. A small trading company called Pengxin, which was never really taken seriously in the past year, has quietly gobbled up about over $500 million in logistics assets. The Chinese company, the China Oils and Food Stuffs Corporation, is taking advantage of some of the problems with Indian companies, especially in sugar refining, to actually buy one of the troubled assets of Renuka Sugar in Sao Paulo. You find a company, CITIC, which is actually a large conglomerate, is buying a key technology piece in agriculture from Dow AgriSciences. Telecom, China Mobile. China Mobile is one of the Chinese telecommunications giants. If its acquisition of the company We is approved, in addition to the Huawei presence and ZTE presence in Brazil, the China Mobile will get access to, I think, 64 million subscribers of this giant network. Medicine, finance, the list goes on and on. In the interest of time, I think you see the point. And it's not just limited to Brazil. As I mentioned before, China is making enormous advances in clean energy, from nuclear to hydroelectric. And it's not just Brazil. You have 2 major projects in Bolivia, the Iravirzu hydroelectric facility, as well as the Rositas hydroelectric facility. You have a facility that was actually just sold off by Odebrecht, the Chagua facility in Peru, et cetera, et cetera. They are in solar, they are in wind. They take advantage of the combination that they provide relatively inexpensive long-term loans in combination with technology solutions, and in some cases, depending on the local partner, actually doing the construction as well. Petroleum. Oftentimes when we think about Chinese petroleum advances, we think about Venezuela or maybe Brazil or Ecuador. The Chinese have actually advanced significantly, not only in their technical abilities, the three major national oil companies, but also in the extent, the geographic extent of their operations. So I would just mention, so for example, you have, for the first time ever, as in Mexico, a very important activity, the semi-privatization of the oil company Pemex. And with that, in the, I believe it was the third round of Pemex solicitations, a Chinese company did a wildly high bid. Actually, I think it was twice the level of the other nearest bidder to actually win access to operate two fields called in what's called the Perdido Basin, literally right on the maritime border between Mexico and the United States. China is advancing in Brazil, although not commonly recognized. One of the major new oil development right now is actually occurring offshore in Guyana, something called the Stabroek Block, the Lisa fields, and beyond ExxonMobil, where our very distinguished Secretary of State Rex Tillerson comes from, the major partner in that is a little company called Nexen, which the Chinese company, China National Offshore Development Corporation, CNODC, actually bought from the Canadians a couple of years ago for about $15.5 billion. So in other words, the major player in that is actually, beyond Exxon, is a Chinese company. Again, the list goes on, but you see really the extent of the spreading out of those activities in that sector. And I could go on, but one of the things that I really wanted to highlight here with this as well was this notion of the diplomatic battle. As you're probably aware, not too long ago, after following about a decade of 8 years of diplomatic truce between the government of the mainland China and the government of Taiwan, the election of Taiwan's new president, Tsai Ing-wen, led the PRC to begin exploring once again changing the diplomatic position of countries from Taiwan to the PRC. This started with two in Africa. First, Gambia, which had previously telegraphed its desires to change recognition. Then Sao Tome and Principe. But the first time that the renewal of that diplomatic warfare crossed over into the Western Hemisphere occurred with Panama. And it's not just about diplomatic recognition, but with projects such as the Margarita Island port facility, which could promise to be a major facility, with the possibility of major new Chinese construction company activity in Panama, major new Chinese potentially petroleum sector activity where CNPC has been silently in Panama for years, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a possibility of, it's not just about the logistics, it's not just about the nefarious people in Hutchison Whampoa. It's really about the fact that the economic development and probably political future of this strategic banking and logistics choke point. Frankly, the future of President Varela's administration in Panama will depend on the way that relationship with China works out. I mean, I think we're going to see economically and politically a dramatic increase in Chinese leverage over the government of Panama. Okay, so turning to a few other things. I just want to mention briefly, of course, that Chinese companies are not without its difficulties, and how to resolve those difficulties is one of the challenges that Chinese companies continue to face, and Chinese government has to face. I mean, whose mail does the embassy answer? Which SOEs does the embassy help, and how? But beyond that, and again, it really opens the question of how does China look out for the interests of its companies, while at the same time not interfering with the policies of Latin American countries. And it was interesting to see that, just as an example of the fact that the Chinese are not 10 feet giants, just literally, I believe 2 days ago, there was the announcement that the Chery, one of the major Chinese automotive companies from Anhui, who has been entering across Latin America in Montevideo and in various markets, in Colombia, etc., Chery actually just announced that they were selling off the factory that they built in Jacareí, Brazil. They frankly had the very bad luck that they made this major decision to build a final assembly plant, largely to escape the Brazilian taxes on the importation of Chery cars. But they made that investment right at the moment when the Brazilian economy began to fall apart. And so things have never gone well. There are many other Chinese success stories. I mean, the Photon facility outside of Bogota, AKT motorcycles, etc. So it's not to say that China's companies are failing across the board. But one has to recognize that, as with any other group of companies, there are some who do better than others. It's often said that China's activities in Latin America are, mostly economic. And I would say, yes, that is largely true. That in terms of dollars and in terms of what's really important, it's mostly about the financing, etc. Having said that, however, it's important for us not to overlook the fact that there are significant and growing activities across the board by China in the military realm as well. And in the 2008 white paper, and in the 2016 white paper, and indeed in its May 2015 defense strategy white paper, which the PLA released, they openly acknowledged the interest in doing that type of military engagement. And so you see this in three areas. You see, first of all, the increase in sophistication of exercises and activities across the region. So we've gone from multilateral humanitarian exercises such as the MINUSTAH presence for 8 years in Haiti to more sophisticated, still humanitarian, but bilateral activities, such as the exercise they did in Peru, Ángel de Paz, with the Peruvians over a mobile field hospital, to the sending twice of their hospital ship to the region, the PSARC. First, just to the Caribbean to make 4 stops, and then coming back a couple of years later in a much broader trip that basically did stops on both the Pacific side and the Atlantic side. And then beyond that, moving in December 2013, while we were very focused here in Washington on the shutdown of the federal government, if you remember those days, I, being part of the federal government, remember it well. But it was interesting that during exactly that period was when a group of 2 Chinese missile frigates went over to Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, where for the first time they actually conducted small but still symbolically important combat exercises with our Chilean counterparts. And so you do see this cautious but significant role of the PLA in the region, which is acknowledged by their own official policy documents. You also see an expansion of military exchanges, professional education, and training. So on the one hand, you see, for example, going from sending Latin American officers to military schools in places like Beijing, Champagne, for maybe 3-week courses, to more sophisticated things, such as, for example, sending Colombian and other cadets to actually the full 4-year course to become an officer in China, kind of the equivalent of our West Point, if you will. And sending of Chinese to certain very prestigious institutions in Latin America. So, for example, in Colombia, in a base called Tolemaida, there is a very prestigious program for basically special forces and other combat training called the Lanceros course. And for the first time, the Chinese just a couple of years ago sent people to participate in the Lanceros course, as well as the demining course. And on the Brazilian side, you have the Chinese sending people to the jungle warfare school in Manaus. So again, you see this continuing to evolve, just as you continue to see arms sales evolve. As with motorcycles and cars and other things, the Chinese have basically recognized arms sales as a strategically privileged sector. Why is that? Well, it's the same reason as cars and telecommunications are a strategically privileged sector. It's good for the overall engagement of China with Latin American counterparts, and it's good for the Chinese defense and technology industrial base. When you work with partners in the region to produce products and iron out those products in local conditions and get insight into how to support them better and how to maintain them better and how to do better training packages, that makes the PLA more robust and that makes the products more robust. We do the same thing in the United States. Our arms sales is part of our all-around relationship with partners as well. However, it's important to recognize that this has moved from just a few politically oriented friends, such as Venezuela, later Ecuador and Bolivia, to the point where you see U.S. partners such as Peru turning around and buying significant amounts of Chinese gear. Indeed, for example, there was a win by a Chinese company of a contract for a multiple launch rocket system where I think the Russians were a little bit worried about this because the Russians have typically been one of Peru's key arms suppliers. And it was interesting that the Chinese basically beat out the Russians in these competitions, showing how the Chinese have brought their quality up to start really competing and threatening the Russians in that kind of mid-level defense market. And there are multiple others. And sometimes the fact that these are small markets does not mean that they are not important. So again, Guyana. I had mentioned already before how strategically important Guyana is for us with its current president, former military officer, Brigadier David Granger. And it's interesting because General Granger, who is arguably one of the sharpest and most astute presidents that Guyana has had in many years, and this is purely my personal opinion, but he believes very much in the use of the GDF for national development activities. The Chinese picked up on that, and it was of note that they recently gifted the GDF 31 different military construction vehicles. In other words, it's not fighters. Well, it's not fighters. It's not a problem. But the Chinese are smart enough to be able to plug into just what it is that President Granger and the GDF needs as part of weaving that all-around relationship with them. And in places like peaceful Costa Rica, which doesn't even have a military, but actually has a very good police force, and always peaceful Colombia, the Chinese have donated small things like transport aircraft and other things. Now I'm told by my Colombian counterparts that they actually don't use those Y-12 transport aircraft. I think they've relegated them to Satena, but Satena actually doesn't use them supposedly. But they're still there. Very briefly to mention telecommunications in space. Again, almost no attention was given in Washington to the fact that just a couple of days ago, the Chinese launched the third satellite for Venezuela. It's called the VRSS-2. So it's not just the satellite, but the fact that the Chinese also built and developed the ground communication equipment and the telecommunications interconnects between those ground stations, and also trained the Venezuelan space personnel just as they trained the Bolivian space personnel and others. In other words, the Chinese effectively own Venezuela's space architecture. Well, it raises an interesting question. The VRSS 1 and 2 are the first satellite was actually a geosynchronous orbit, what they call a telecommunications relay satellite. But the second one and this new one are what they call Earth observation satellites. And if you look at the type of orbit that you need, low Earth orbit for Venezuela, it also passes by some pretty interesting parts of the United States, especially the southern reaches of the United States, which raises the question, Venezuela, which can't even pay, possibly its October and November bond payments while continuing to feed its people who have lost on the average something like 10% of their body weight over the past couple of years just because of the abject, horrible conditions in the country. Why is it for Venezuela or the Chinese so important that when Venezuela can't even import enough food and medicine for its own people, that they are paying up for a satellite built by the Chinese, to which the Chinese almost assuredly have access to, that provides potential observation capabilities over the south of the United States? Again, it's just an interesting question that is raised by these Venezuelan and apparently Chinese spending priorities. And in fairness, one can make the argument that there actually was an issue with the launch vehicle, so the Chinese can say, well, it really was delayed. It should have been launched a year ago, but the question's still there. Very briefly, I'll mention that there are issues with trans-Pacific organized crime. So as we build up the commercial infrastructure in the region for doing business, the banking infrastructure, the containerization of cargo, this raises issues of going with it, money laundering, precursor chemicals, human trafficking, et cetera, et cetera. And strategically, why in part this is relevant to the United States is what happened in Argentina. Because in most of Latin America, there is just about zero capability to combat Chinese organized crime. They don't have the people with the local linguistic capabilities. You might have 3 people who have studied to speak Mandarin Chinese, but can they speak Cantonese? Can they speak Hakka? Zero. So in the case of Argentina, where they had a relatively difficult problem with a Chinese mafia group called Pishui. They actually brought in members of the Chinese National Police to basically work undercover in Argentina to solve that problem. And it's interesting, it'll be interesting to see that now that Panama has changed over to the PRC, whether whatever intel cooperation may have been being received from the Taiwanese, whether this will create a need and an opening for the Panamanian National Police now to start again bringing Chinese National Police in to try to combat that. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of business that gets done with China through Panama that, in the banking sectors, logistics, et cetera, there's a great need. But with that great need, it creates an enormous strategic opportunity for the Chinese in terms of that type of cooperation. I'm sure there'll be questions about Venezuela in the Q&A. So the only thing I really want to emphasize about this is that, number one, China actually is owed far less by Venezuela than is often assumed. The high-end credible estimate I've seen is from a firm called Ecoanalytica, which is about $25 billion. I personally believe it may be closer to 10 to 15, because most of the loans over the past decade have been relatively short-term, 3-year loans. And oh, by the way, the Chinese actually, through the oil for loans contracts, basically are in physical control of the pumping of the oil that they use to repay their own loans, which, oh, by the way, generally never leaves China, because the money is basically a line of credit in a Chinese bank, usually CDB, which pays for projects that go to Chinese companies. So my point about all this is there seems to be this assumption that China's interest is to turn against Maduro to avoid not getting paid the supposedly $62 billion that has been given. But I would argue that the Chinese are owed very little. They're kind of like the two hunters that run into a bear in the woods, if you've ever heard that joke, where the one hunter starts putting on his tennis shoes and the other hunter says, "Why are you doing that?" And you can't outrun a bear. And the hunter says, "I don't have to outrun a bear, I just have to outrun you." The Chinese probably know that Venezuela will economically collapse. So the calculus is not whether it will collapse or not, but whether the Chinese are in a condition to get paid before Rosneft and before Western interests when that collapse actually occurs, if it can't be averted. So at the end of the day, you basically have a position where I think a lot of the analysis is done. I personally believe, and based on also some of my conversations with friends in China and people who work in Chinese corporations, that the Chinese are probably as anxious to see a political transition in Venezuela as is the United States. It's just that what China wants Venezuela to transition to may be a little bit different than what the United States wants Venezuela, which actually should make President Maduro relatively nervous because it isn't him, whichever side that you look to. So last slide, then I'll open it up for questions, and I apologize for the length. But so what? Why should we care about this economic advance? As some of my good friends who know China very well say, it's just about economics, and you people in Washington D.C. I mean, you're paranoid, especially you people that work for DoD. I mean, you see everything as bad. I don't believe that the Chinese necessarily are engaging in Latin America because they're evil and nefarious people. I believe that they're trying to make a world safe for the continued rise of China. But what I also believe is that however much the Chinese would like to avoid it, that has serious strategic and security consequences for the United States that without begrudging the Chinese, we need to openly acknowledge and work to minimize, both through working with the Chinese and in some cases in friendly competition with some of the things that they would like to achieve. Because in Latin America, what you see is that the U.S. voice and leverage in pursuing our policy goals, human rights, democracy, Western institutions, rule of law, is being weakened. The Chinese, both in a number of cases, are alternative sources of credit in markets. Chinese companies, as I mentioned before, are getting ever better in using their soft power as local employers and providers of tax revenues to be able to increase leverage over local governments. You have the effective center. I would argue that Venezuela and Ecuador and Bolivia's government would not be in the situation that they are today in terms of their liquidity. They perhaps would have been forced to make certain compromises under the weight of their own internal contradictions of their policy had it not been for significant creditors such as China. Although China never tries to associate themselves with the political programs, but at the end of the day, effectively the Chinese have enabled these anti-U.S. regimes. the trade not rules oriented regime in the Pacific, which I would argue actively threatens not only U.S. interests across the Pacific, but over the long term threatens the interests of our Japanese partners, of our Korean partners, of our Indian partners, of our Mexican partners, of our Chilean partners, of our Peruvian partners, et cetera. We don't want to cut off China's right to be part of the international trading regime, but I would argue that we have a strong strategic interest to have a fair, equitable, level playing field in which the Chinese and all other players can have a role. And globally, again, if you think about the role of moving towards a world in which, away from a dollar-dominated international economy, and frankly, a world in which it's hard for us to imagine a world in which the majority of Western capital flows don't go to the United States and Western companies, in which Western companies are not the ones that fundamentally make decisions about where to realize productive relationships. And that might sound a little bit like Raoul Prebisch and Emmanuel Wallerstein, but at the end of the day, we are moving to a world in which those returns to capital and implicitly those decisions and influences are moving slowly but surely away from the United States and towards Beijing. Again, that's not a nefarious thing that the Chinese are doing, but it's something that will profoundly impact the U.S. and Western Hemisphere standards of living and quality of life. And finally, let me just conclude that one of the things that worries me as well is we are moving towards a new moral order. A new moral order in the sense that he who has the money, people are reluctant to criticize. And I see it in Latin America in terms of businessmen and leaders. I see it in international forums. I see it in the think tank forums where there's increasingly a reluctance to, one holds one's tongue in terms of talking about the negative impacts of Chinese activities because there's always that worry. There's always an economic interest for the think tank, for the institution. It's like, okay, let's just not publish that report. Let's just not put that item in the report. Let's just not invite this speaker to our activity because they might offend the Chinese. And oh, by the way, another part of our company has this really lucrative contract with this Chinese think tank. We are moving towards a moral order in which our Western concept of open, freely self-destructive criticism of everything we want to criticize and destroy is possible. And it worries me deeply, the implications of that order. And I think it's something that we, especially now, need to try to think about. So again, thank you very, very much. And with that, I'm open to any questions that you have. How would you prefer? Okay, I'll let Jaime be the objective decider of questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, my name is Wayne Young with Port of Harlem Magazine, and my first question is, and I'll make it short, what's the difference, in your opinion, between trading with China and American companies to the people who are doing the buying? And number two, we cover things in Gambia, so I'm glad you mentioned the word Gambia. I was actually there when there was a switch between the Taiwanese to the Chinese, and my basic opinion is that you can see how the thought process just changed as far as who loved who, and you can respond to how it's also affecting Africa.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, first of all, there are many good Chinese companies and there are bad Chinese companies. There are good Western companies, there are bad Western companies. I would like to, so I'm talking in terms of tendencies. So there are certain tendencies that one observes. So, for example, in some of the major Chinese construction companies and in others where there is a tendency to work with the Chinese banking partner to set up a deal in which the selection of the financing package is accompanied by a commitment to use a particular Chinese company, and oftentimes even down to the level of the subcontractors. Companies, for example, in some of the Venezuelan deals, it wasn't just that it was going to be China Harbor CCCC, but it was also that it would be XCMG, the state-oriented construction company that actually supplied some of the equipment, actually explicitly paid for or rented under the contract. There's an interesting study that was done in Peru by Chinese mining companies, which found that Chinese mining companies technically have some social capital considerations, and indeed, the Chinese government, I think, understanding the importance of that, has recognized the need to do more, and has actually given official instructions to its companies to not avoid that. But at the end of the day, there's questions about to what degree are those things enforced, and again, you see across the board. So on the one hand, you had a company like China Aluminum Corporation, which in the Toromocho project did a pretty good job in hiring people and doing socially responsible things and managed the negotiations with the local community. On the other hand, you have China Minmetals, which has had just no end of problems since they jumped in on top of the Las Bambas project, which they basically forced the Australians to liquidate and sell off to them. So it's really a mixed bag, but at the end of the day, I think there is oftentimes a tendency for certain predatory behaviors that come from, number one, the leveraging of the loans to guide companies and subcontractors, and number two, perhaps a different attitude about what rights are owed beyond what is there in the contract towards workers, towards the payment of bonuses, towards labor hours. I remember talking with one very sharp Chinese friend in Colombia, and I asked him, I said, what's one of the biggest headaches that you have here in Bogota? And he looked at me and very honestly said, Chinese labor laws. I mean, we have to do all of these things and pay overtime and not. And so again, it's not nefarious, but it's a different attitude that has significant consequences. I think that we need to take into. Again, I think there are some American companies that are better and not. I think there's two issues. I think number one, U.S. companies are subject to significant transparency requirements, especially to the degree to which they are openly traded, which not all Chinese companies, except those who are doing business in Western companies and registered in U.S. stock exchanges, are. Number two, I think sometimes there's the culture that the Chinese companies have, which is maybe a little bit different from the culture of U.S. companies. So, for example, one of the best known and oldest disasters in the mining sector in Peru was a Chinese company operating in Marcona, Peru, called Shogun. And actually, a U.S. company had been the one that initially developed the Marcona mine, and as part of that, its culture had developed had provided water and schools and things for the local community because there was a certain concept. And in fairness, it was later taken over by the Peruvian government, nationalized, and that created some problems as well. But the attitude of Shogun, again, it wasn't trying to cheat the people, but there was not the same attitude of we're going to, if it's not in the contract, we're not obliged to provide it. And as has happened actually in many, many different African countries with Chinese construction projects, that type of attitude is caused a lot of friction. But there are good and bad American companies as well. But I think there are and of course there are certain things also like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which mean that a U.S. executive is legally liable and may spend time in jail for acts of corruption. It's not that the Chinese do not say that the corruption is illegal, but one can argue that in their foreign operations, many Chinese companies have not felt the same limits. Matter of fact, one of the jokes among some of my friends was that when President Xi started his anti-corruption drive for whatever reasons, that actually suspended a lot of Chinese projects in Latin America, in Africa, because all of the Chinese factory heads who were used to getting kickbacks were now worried that they would now become vulnerable to President Xi's anti-corruption drive. So there are differences. I think it's important to not say that there are, it's black or white, but there are important differences and I think there are differences where, not all Chinese companies are incorrigible and irreformable, but I think it's important for us to. And in places like Brazil, for example, where the state has imposed its negotiating position, it's arguably come to better working relationships. To be perfectly frank, what I've seen across the region is the places where the Chinese companies have taken the advantage of the local Latin American government and have most, mistreated the workers have been in all the countries. And why is it? Because they've basically been given carte blanche to give do whatever they want without the institutional and political oversight adequately of the regime. And so at the end of the day, good governance and good institutions are, I think, one of the recipes for a healthy relationship with Chinese companies rather than some of the more destructive tendencies which are possible. But so you raise many, many good questions. So forgive me for taking advantage of that to pile on, but thank you. Yes, sir. Okay.
With the current, Hani O'Kaley, management consultant, with the current NAFTA talks and the uncertainty of what's going to happen, where does China stand vis-a-vis Mexico, and what do you think they have in mind if the agreement is dissolved?
And I'm glad you asked the question. And Mexico is a fascinating case. I think on the one hand, the Chinese have been somewhat reluctant to aggressively pursue projects in Mexico just because of its proximity. And frankly, it's been harder for them to do so vis-a-vis countries such as Brazil because Mexico's producers have been so entwined with the United States. And so it's hard to make the economic case why Mexico should sell its avocados to China when you have to do commercialized shipping containers as opposed to, just sending them up, across the border into the United States and similar other things. Frankly, Mexico is probably, of all the Latin American countries, the country which has perhaps the greatest intellectual capital for doing business with China, but has least realized it. If you look at the number of students from the programs from UNAM in Mexico City to other programs, like Tech in Monterrey, from a very early point, the Mexicans had literally hundreds and hundreds of young students who could speak Mandarin Chinese, who had experience doing things with China. Part of the problem has been the inability of the Mexican government and the Secretary of Economia to really capitalize on that and break into markets. And part of that had to do with the inherent competitive nature. In other words, it wasn't, like Chile, our primary export is copper and potassium nitrate, and then we'll import Chinese goods, and then, at the margins, we'll do really good things with marketing and sell a lot of cherries and table grapes. It was, there was that inherent conflict. And by the way, frankly, you also had a very well politically organized manufacturing sector and business groupings who were just, very worried to avoid that the Chinese set foot in the countries. And so you had a lot of high-profile projects. I could mention Dragon Mart in Quintana Roo that were, had a lot of difficulties. Over the long term, though, a lot more projects have gone forward in Mexico than you would think. So, so you've got there's a photon facility that's been there for years. There's a tube there's a metal copper tube facility. Huawei actually has a pretty strong presence, although still limited. But the problem is that the structural limitations, and I would argue that the political limitations, and I think there's some particular issues with President Peña Nieto's current government, is I think there's the desire there to say, well, if si los pinches gringos nos van a maltratar así. But the problem is, at the end of the day, that desire to sell all of Mexico's pork and sell all of Mexico's corn and sell all of Mexico's oil to the Chinese keeps getting limited by those structural factors. And so the CNOOC deal was interesting, and the new factory in Hidalgo was interesting, but that was just a couple $100 million. I think over the long term, the structural interest will continue to push Mexico, whatever happens with NAFTA, and I hope things go well with NAFTA, towards the natural relationship that we have as the feuding members of the family. Well, the Chinese clearly already are. I mean, it's not unperceived by some of us in Washington that in his sexenio, Peña Nieto has actually met with President Xi 7 times. I don't think there's any other Latin American leader who's met so many times. And so there's the clear interest. And I think part of it may also come through the Pacific Alliance. So you have, now the problem is the Pacific Alliance has its own problems, but I think Mexico clearly wants to look towards the Pacific. But as Mexico looks toward the Pacific, it's not just China. Mexico also has great interests in terms of manufacturing and other things of other Pacific partners. Japan, Korea, India has a major presence in multiple sectors in Mexico. It's one of Mexico's most important Asian investors. And so it's not just about China, but sometimes in the political discourse, you just see it. But it's I'm hopeful at the end of the day that this unfortunate quarrel between families we will be able to overcome. Yes, sir.
Alec Jackson, I'm a research intern here at Hudson. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the potential security implications of Chinese having that strong control over particularly nuclear infrastructure in Latin American countries, and what risk do you see there?
Sure. Well, in general, I think there are a lot of issues that security sector decision makers in the United States have to take. I don't think that the nuclear sector is one of the principal ones. Certainly, nuclear technology is an important energy technology which will contribute to the continued rise and diversification of the Chinese state. I think they are probably right. Matter of fact, I think probably some of the most positive contributions that you see by Chinese companies have to do with clean energy, the advances that are made in nuclear, hydroelectric, wind, et cetera. Having said that, the security things that perhaps most worry me is the fact that in the undesirable possibility of a conflict with China, say in the South China Sea or East China Sea, as they continue to build islands that were used to not be there, you can imagine a Taiwan scenario, you can imagine a Japan scenario, et cetera. But it's not that China wants or that the United States wants a conflict, but in the undesirable event of a conflict, it's almost unthinkable to assume that China would allow the United States to play an away game. And so if you start walking through the logic, you say, okay, China has economic leverage and informational leverage gathered through its resources in the region, theoretically, to influence the decision of Latin American leaders in what way they participate in a coalition. If we can't get the OAS to act on Venezuela, given the ridiculousness that's going on there, how do we expect that companies who are deeply, countries that are deeply working with the Chinese would support a U.S. activity, in Asia? But beyond that, there are other things. One can imagine the PLA decision makers looking at a map. If I was a PLA decision maker, I would start looking at a map and start asking questions like, well, if we wanted to insert people in to disrupt activities in the United States, teams to gather information, teams to create a diversion, you have a lot of ports of embarkation and points of sustainment in the United States that are remarkably close to Chinese-operated commercial facilities. And for me, it's less about Panama. And it's more about Freeport, which is 65 miles off of the coast of the United States, where, oh, by the way, Chinese companies have put in $10 billion in, it's the container facility, it's the logistics redistribution facilities, it's the air facility, and this new $4.2 billion Baja Mar hotel. And at the very end of the day, the relationships, the mill-to-mill relationships, we often assume that in a war, China doesn't have any bases in the hemisphere. One can look clearly at what they've done progressing across Africa, first the counter-piracy operations in Somalia, then the sending of first peacekeeping and now, combat forces in places like Darfur, most recently the establishment of a facility in Djibouti. Oftentimes I look in Africa as indications of where China will act or how China will act in Latin America as its power and confidence continues to expand. But what that gets you to is the remote but not dismissible conclusion at the end of the day that, in 10 years, it's not unthinkable that, just like there were some Germans in World War II that thought that Mexico might be willing to bet against the United States because of certain territories that used to belong to Mexico, like parts of California and New Mexico and Texas, et cetera. And they chose not to. I mean, we thank Mexico for that and remember that kindly. But it is not unthinkable that there would not be, in that type of conflict in 10 years, actors who would not be willing to just let China have use of air facilities, just let China have use of naval facilities. And in that, the rate at which China, based on the commercial knowledge, the logistics work that they actually now do in the commercial side, based on their mill-to-mill interactions, the rate at which they could turn a no basis present into a usable access situation, I think is a lot faster than many people recognize. And so to me, it's a false dichotomy to say, well, it's just commercial, because there are things that U.S. strategic decision makers need to be thinking about that are the implications of those, well-intentioned but just commercial activities. And yes, sir, and I'll get to you, sir.
Jonas Senior Fellow here with the Hudson Institute. Two questions on Venezuela. One on sort of China's sort of political maneuverability. They have, reached out also to the opposition, and which, in a sort of stringent interpretation of non-interference, they would sort of prefer just to speak with the government. But of course, knowing that there is potentially a change of guard, they need to sort of secure that. So your thoughts on how deft they've actually been at that, at sort of being able to sort of look for their interests out in the future, because they've sometimes been good, sometimes not been that good. In Libya, in 2011, they managed to be sort of the last one to recognize the new regime, and therefore was a little bit of a latecomer when there's a sudden change. And then the same on the economic front in Venezuela, when you mentioned that their main priority would be that their own loans would be paid back. So if Venezuela were to default, which would be largely a sort of Chinese default, how do you see precisely there to cure that? Because normally you would have a sort of IMF restructuring or something, and here it would suddenly be China that would have to sort of help to make a 5-year plan.
It's a great question. So first of all, in terms of Venezuela, I think that China has actually done a reasonably good job at adjusting to a situation which politically and culturally coming into a place that it really knew very little about, and whose dynamics are very much against what most, guys who just try to make a living in China as managers and technicians and things, have to deal with. And yes, the Chinese have talked to the opposition, and I think there have been a series of surprises that I think are rippling through the Chinese government and corporate culture about that, we really need to think about doing this and this. And so I think there have been a series of wake-up calls. Clearly, Libya was a wake-up call that if you continue to just do government-to-government things and the government collapses, you might have to evacuate a whole lot of people in the collapse. And I understand that the Chinese actually do have, there's been some consideration of the possibility if they had to do a non-combatant evacuation operation out of Venezuela, but I don't think that's a immediate threat right now. Beyond that, but actually the something like 200,000 Chinese, both corporate persons and others, a number of the Chinese have actually been kind of quietly getting out of Venezuela. And it's ironic that a number of Chinese Venezuelans show up in places like Trinidad and Tobago and the Dominican Republic, because, frankly, if you are seen as Chinese, you're assumed to have a lot of money, either because you're a corporate type or you're a shopkeeper that may keep a lot of cash. And so, ironically, as the Venezuelan criminal situation in places like the Greater Caracas area has gotten worse, the Chinese have had problems with being targets. My sense with the government, though, is that really the 2012, Maduro getting sick, Chavez getting sick, the secession struggle with Maduro was also kind of a wake-up call. And I've talked to a number of my Chinese colleagues, and I think they're pretty sincere. There is that, how did we get into this position? I think the Chinese still have a lot more cards than I think is commonly recognized, and I think there was some sprinkling of working with the opposition. But again, at the end of the day, the Chinese are pumping the oil. Their loan exposure is far less. If you think about if when the Russians wanted to get back into Cuba, they turned around like that with a lot less capital and were willing to pardon 30 of their $35 billion in outstanding Cold War debt just to get back on the Cubans' bad side, which only kind of worked. For the Chinese, where China Investment Corporation has something like $900 billion, of which $300 billion may be non-performing loans. So, to what degree is China willing to put in check a strategic interest in Venezuela because it's so worried about the possibility of losing maybe $10 to $15 billion. So I think we often misstate that calculation. And the other thing, frankly, is I think the Chinese style, and you see it in places like North Korea as well. The Chinese tend to be very reluctant to openly betray a friend, and the Chinese actually don't have that many politically friends who are real friends around the world. And so, if the Chinese are not willing to sell out Kim Jong-un, how reluctant are they going to be to sell out Nicolás Maduro, however frustrated they may be? So my sense is that the Chinese and I think that the Chinese are actually in a better position than the Russians. I think Igor Sechin with Rosneft is kind of hanging out there with maybe $8 billion. I think that Rosneft has in IOUs from the Venezuelan government, and Citgo possibly not being approved as a Rosneft asset by the CFIUS review. But I think at the end of the day, the Chinese are not in that bad of a situation. I think they're hoping to get to a transition of a still anti-U.S. government, but maybe one that looks a little bit more like Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, that's at least a competent anti-U.S. socialist government, as opposed to a bleedingly incompetent one. And so I think the Chinese are looking for a different type of transition. And ironically, you could argue that everything that we do for graduated sanctions pushes the Venezuelan situation more in the direction the Chinese would want it to go, because they can dribble out little bits of cash and consolidate their holdings in the oil fields, and really strengthen their position and their control over the transition without necessarily bringing the government down in a way that perhaps could lead to an outcome that would look good in Washington. In terms of the actual economic situation, again, I'm looking very closely at the upcoming bond payments, especially this month and next month. I think there's a total of about $2.9 billion, if I'm not mistaken. But the Chinese have control over. The current accounts of PDVSA are actually in CITIC Bank in China. A lot of gold reserves are actually in China, which ironically those and others could be liquidated. Again, the oil accounts are largely in places like CDB, Chinese banks. And so I don't think we're at a point yet where the Chinese have serious reasons to worry about losing money or a collapse. I think we could be to that point, but I don't think that we're there yet, but it's a great question. Yes, sir. And I'll get to the question in the back after that.
Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. I don't think I've ever heard a lecture that has viewed implications of anybody's policy in as many areas that you have done. I congratulate you, whether it was military, economic, social. It was a great lecture and very wide-ranging. Thank you.
I'm honored. Thank you.
Let me focus on a short question and a long question. Short question is, are there, excuse the expression, Chinatowns, areas of Chinese population like there are Japanese and others throughout Latin America, and this is something that China is able to play on? My trade question is a little bit different and so on. China has great influence in Africa because it's East Asian trade model is being followed. I don't see it being followed that much successfully in Latin America. Number two, because of the fact that a lot of Chinese components, etc., are assembled in Africa for shipment around the world. In fact, many people say our major objective in NAFTA is to change the content rule so there can be much less Chinese components that can be assembled in that particular area and so on. And thirdly, what really Latin America needs the United States and Europe for is this market, and we do not see, other than of course in minerals, we do not see China providing a market for value-added products from Latin America. So what is the real threat in the, quote, manufacturing or in the trade area? Thank you again.
Sure. And great questions. First of all, with respect to the Chinatowns, that's it's somewhat of a complicated question, and it varies by country. Of course, as you recall, during the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, as the last Chinese dynasty fell apart, you had a significant outflow. And so to this day, certain parts of Latin America have significant Chinese communities. So, of course, in the greater Lima area around Peru, another small grouping in the, what's now the Chile, in places like Panama, and in certain but not other parts of the Caribbean, where again Chinese laborers immigrated to work on various different plantations and railroad projects and things like that. And then, frankly, some of those communities have been augmented by Chinese construction projects over recent years. And so, as for example, Desi Bouterse in Suriname, and actually his predecessor began bringing in Chinese companies, you had a rapid growth of the Chinese, who actually are about 1/5 of the current Surinamese population, but they always were. And that's one of the, but in Panama, depending on how you count, you have maybe 40%. And so the issue always is, what is the relationship between that community and Chinese companies? And it's often very complicated. Often, many of the previous generation Chinese communities have lost touch. I mean, maybe they speak Cantonese or Hakka and don't necessarily have either the business connections or the linguistic connections, although sometimes they aspire to position themselves that way. In some places, it works better than others. And so, for example, in Georgetown, Guyana, it's actually the Chinese community. I remember actually one of the biggest trading companies that imports Chinese goods in Guyana is a company called China Trading. I've actually met their 30-something millionaire, a gentleman by the name of Jason Wong. I don't remember his Chinese name, but very much taking advantage of that of those connections. In other places, I remember the Ecuadorian Chinese community in Guayaquil, who unfortunately was on the wrong side of Ecuador's current politics, always lamented that the Chinese companies preferred to deal with the Korea government and not with them. So I think it really just depends. And there's a political dimension, because in many cases, the Chinese community in the countries that recognize Panama was actually also an important tool for the Taiwanese. And so, for example, you have a situation in Panama, which is fascinating, because you have a large, matter of fact, some of the most reputable institutions in Panama, and some of the schools and places like that actually have Chinese surnames because of that Chinese ethnicity. And I suspect that the new Chinese ambassador in Panama right now is racing against the clock, basically to identify, organize, and basically regroup the ethnic Chinese in a way that at the very least won't be a business and other threat to the PRC, and at the best can be more in service to the PRC. And there are a number of things that the Chinese do at the strategic level, and so there's the sponsorship of ethnic visits, and so there's an emphasis of your common ethnic heritage, and there's certain scholarships to bring people over to China to rediscover their mainland Chinese ethnic roots, which become a way of building bridges to those societies. But those have some success, but not others. With respect to, remind me your second question, sir.
The trade question and the fact that the U.S. is trying to push China out of Mexico by having a very strong regional context.
No, and that's a great point. And that really depends on the sector. So, for example, of the sectors that I mentioned, the one sector where you've seen that type of behavior has been in manufacturing, where Chinese CKD facilities, companies like in automotive, it was Jack and Chery and some others in Brazil, Photon in Mexico that I mentioned, some others. You say, well, why has the concentration of Chinese manufacturing investment in automotive, et cetera, been primarily in Brazil and Mexico? Well, in Brazil, it was a big internal market with a prospect of access to a bigger market through the Mercosur arrangements. In Mexico, it was the hopes of access eventually to the U.S. market. And indeed, I think FAW and a number of the other Chinese auto deals, the idea was we'll start in Mexico, and then once we're ready to advance into the United States. But as you point out, NAFTA has some really high local content provisions, much higher than some of the other deals. And so that, I think that's been an important obstacle. And then your third question. Okay.
The third question was, is there any country, unlike in Africa, any country in Latin America that is following the Chinese economic model of development successfully, or even quasi-successfully?
That's a great, and I think that the Chinese themselves are very reluctant to say that there is a Chinese economic model in the sense that something that could be ideologically exported. They're happy to me, it goes back to the Chinese self-concept. I mean, China, after all, the very name China means Middle Kingdom. I mean, from its very existence, the Chinese have seen themselves at the center of the universe, which, ironically, one of the reasons why I think often our discourse misses the Chinese discourse is because, we're in a situation where basically both superpowers see themselves as the centers of the universe. But to that extent, it's a different concept for the Chinese because whereas we look to export universal values that we want to convert everyone. I think it goes back to kind of our Protestant heritage. Whereas the Chinese say, as long as the tribute is flowing to China and they recognize the emperor as the son of heaven, we're good with that. So I don't think the Chinese are. I think the Chinese are happy to suggest that they have a model if that will play to their advantage. But I don't think that the Chinese look to export an ideology if that operates to the disadvantage of their companies and their political relationships. And where that leads you at the end of the day. Now, I think what you'll see at the currently opening 19th Party Congress is that President Xi will be projecting a much more self-confident notion of China that, look how we've succeeded and, maybe there is some type of model, but I don't think China is defining what the model is or, the steps that others should follow it. But what you do see is that companies like Venezuela, countries like Venezuela and others, to the degree they take the Chinese money, CDB and others are happy to send their advisors and others to kind of help them work out the relationship between, well, how do you build the infrastructure and make this work, et cetera. So at the end of the day, China helping those socialist countries getting it right is, in effect, a type of influence over their economic and political organization. It's a type of really kind of guidance of the political administrative decisions that these countries are taking. Will help you develop. And I think we need to be very careful of that type of influence that, okay, we'll let the Chinese engineers tell you how to do your 5-year economic plan because, you don't know how to get it right. The Chinese seem to get it right. So if you just do things the Chinese way and buy Chinese products and use Chinese companies, then, you too will get rich, or at least the leaders will. So I think we need to recognize that there are political influences and leverage behind that it's not necessarily nefarious, but I think we need to keep an eye on. But those are great questions, sir. Yes.
I think that's going to be the last question. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Patrick Trainer, DoD. One of the questions that we get, and one of the topics that is often in the news is Chinese influence and Russian influence in Latin America. What do you see the relationship between the Chinese government and Russian government, or Chinese business, more importantly, businesses and Russian businesses interacting in the region? Is it an adversarial relationship? Is it sort of you have your areas of interest, we have ours? Could you go into that?
Sure. No, it's a great question. My sense is, first of all, it's complicated. Now, you will know that at the political level, the type of explicit cooperation that you see in Asia, for example, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or with military exercises between China and Russia, you really don't see that type of cooperation in Latin America. I think at the corporate level, in general, there's more of a competition. The Chinese arms companies, Norinco, Polytechnologies, AVIC, et cetera, are basically taking market share away from the Russians. And so there's a competition there. There's a competition, or in some cases there's benefit, but for example, in the mining sector, you've got Russia Aluminum Corporation, Rusal, and it's actually the Chinese are basically buying defunct Russian mining companies in places like operations in places like Jamaica as they, lack the liquidity to put the investment in themselves. Other sectors like petroleum, you find again, companies like Rosneft are. I mean, there's probably enough Venezuelan oil for both, but there's a certain inherent competition. Now, having said that, I think there's an inherent synergy in that with all the countries which are disposed basically to deal with the Chinese, the Russians, and a few others, that the Chinese capital that they loan, while it mostly goes towards the purchase of Chinese projects and Chinese products, does help those regimes to maintain solvency and political latitude so that they can also do things with the Russians that they'd never dare. And so, while the Chinese style would never have been to send nuclear-capable bombers like the Russians did first in 2008 and again 2014 to Venezuela, the fact that the Chinese continue to bankroll the Venezuelan regime allowed for the continuity of course, Chavez and now Maduro in power, that gave him the latitude then to reach out and accept. In those moments when Vladimir Putin wanted to send the nefarious gringos a message about mucking around in the Russian backyard, thanks to Chinese money, there was a leader in Caracas that was willing to do that. And so there's a inherent, I don't think there's actual coordination, but who knows what you don't know. But at the end of the day, it comes down to good governance to me, because it's not that the Chinese or the Chinese companies are bad. It's not that, frankly, the Russian companies are bad. But at the end of the day, if you have open, transparent decisions and credible democratic governance, they will help the development of the peoples of those countries and not create openings for basically anti-Western, resentful populist projects. And by the way, at the end of the day, you will force Chinese, Russian, and other companies to behave in such a way that is market following and beneficial for those places, rather than to basically capture those markets to the benefit of just a handful of leaders. So I think it's at the end of the day, it's all about governance. But if we do it wrong, we see some of the very unfortunate effects. But great question. Yes.
We thank you very much for your attendance this afternoon, and we'll keep you posted on the next one. Why don't we give Dr. Ellis a final round of applause?